according to you, as on the date when Constitution was enforced, which part of Article 28 will apply? Which clause of Article 28 will apply?
No, 3.
Not 1 and 2?
1 and 3. 2 may not apply, 1 and 3.
1 applies, then is it possible for that institution to grant or permit religious instructions?
1 is absolute, my lord, that's what your lordship said. It may not be permissible, my lord. As the Constitution reads, my lord, it may not be permissible. But, my lord, possibly
Then when we, the 1951 amendment, which is is in terms of 3. To give an option, when you say 3 applies, indirectly you are accepting it as a minority institution. Because 3 only applies to minority institutions.
No, my lord.
Yes. Now, sorry. It applies to non-state funded institutions, only non-state funded institutions.
Yeah.
You're right to that.
Yes, yes. So, but in any case, this is not.
Or in case of state funded institutions, which are minority institutions, 3 obviously will apply.
Now, my lord, section 9 was deleted, my lord, if your lordship sees, my lord. Section 9, my lord, which required, please see, my lord, 9, original act. The court shall have power to make statutes providing.
Let's go back to Article 28 and the proviso to section 8.
I'm sorry, my lord, I was little taken.
We'll just go back to the proviso.
No, I was on the last point, my lord. My apologies, my lord. But I genuinely feel I can and I will. 81. The 81 amendment, my lord. My apologies for that.
No, the 81 amendment. Let's see section 8 for a moment. We were looking at section 8 at your on that page.
As it stood, my lord?
No, after the 81 amendment, because the 81 amendment is in red.
You know, 51 is in red.
I'm sorry. I meant the 51 amendment. The 51 amendment is in red.
Correct.
Now, what the 51 amendment does is introduces the proviso, provided that nothing in this section shall be deemed to prevent religious instruction being given in the manner prescribed by the ordinances to those who have consented to receive it.
Correct.
It expressly allows for religious instruction in AMU, subject to the consent of those who are receiving religious instruction. Now, under what provision of Article 28 does this proviso to Section 8 fall? If you look at the first clause of Article 28, the first clause of Article 28 interposes a complete bar, right? See Article 28(1).
No religious instruction shall be provided in any educational institution wholly maintained out of the state funds.
No, it is maintained out of state funds. For a moment, we'll take it on the basis that it is wholly maintained out of state funds. So, any form of religious instruction would ex facie be barred in AMU by virtue of the provisions of Article 28(1). Now, Article 28(2), Clause 2 lifts the bar to a certain extent.
Except
right?
For 2 exceptions.
Right.
Yes.
Now, where does it lift the bar? Let's read 28(2). Nothing in Clause 1 shall apply to...
I'll read, your lordship. Shall apply to an educational institution which is administered by the state but has been established under any endowment or trust which requires that religious instruction shall be imparted in such institution.
And now what does 3 do? That no person who attends such an institution, a state-aided institution, will be compelled to undergo religious instruction unless the parent or guardian has consented. This puts the requirement of consent. So Clause 2, then otherwise there would have been an absolute bar under Article 28(1). What Clause 2 of Article 28 does is to lift the bar. In the case of an institution which may be otherwise administered by the state, but which has been established under an endowment or trust which requires that religious instruction shall be imparted in such institution. So,
2 doesn't apply in fact.
Proviso, perhaps, the proviso to Section 8 is in recognition of, is an implementation of the provisions or is pursuant to the provisions of Clause 2 of Article 28. But for Clause 2 of Article 28, that proviso would have run afoul of Clause 1 of Article 28. So that proviso comes in as a result of clause 2 of Article 28. Now, when it comes under clause 2 of 28, it's in recognition of the fact that this is established by a trust or endowment, which requires that religious instruction has to be given or imparted in such institution.
So the
That possibly
government
may be
is
the position.
kind of bound by the covenants of that, my lord, trust or
The endowment
endowment.
or trust.
Yes. Another thing, just two has no relevance. It's a different fact. 28. Lord, one, Lord, my respectful submission is that even if there is some, Lord, some internal generation of money, possibly one may not apply, but that situation we are not facing. Here it would be 3. That is why section 9 is deleted. Number 1. Number 2, 28 is agnostic.
What it permits is, what the 51 amendment permits is, you can impart religious instructions in this institution.
Yes. And, my lord, important.
Education in this institution. So, indirectly, they are saying that one will not apply. Now, one may not apply if the institution falls under Article 30.
No, not necessarily.
We'll have to harmoniously interpret Article 28 and Article 30.
May I, my lord, answer that question, my lord? Lord, may I give one more? Lordships can, my lord, at this stage examine. 28 is an agnostic provision. It applies to minority as well as non-minorities.
Correct?
So, even if it is a minority institution or non-minority institution, one says if it is wholly.
It introduces the character of secularism in education.
Yes. And 3 kinds of take a middle path. That all right, if you wish to, you provide, but don't compel. And even in case of a minority, academically and constitutionally, it is possible that a minority institution, say Hindu, the Muslim minority institution, may say that we will provide religious education both in Hindu studies and Islamic studies. What they cannot do, they cannot compel the students. So it is, my lord, the
3 is a provision which is against compulsion. What 3 does is basically to create an option. That's why 9 came to be deleted, really speaking in that sense.
Exactly, I am obliged.
9 was deleted.
Simultaneously.
9 provided for compulsory religious instruction to Muslim students.
Yes, therefore.
Now, after the deletion of 9, it's not that religious instruction is done away with, but all students, Muslim or otherwise, have now a choice.
It may be, therefore, an exception to both 1 and 2. Read it carefully.
Another very important aspect of 3 is, 3 applies even if you are not wholly maintained out of state funds. Because 3 merely says receiving aid. Receiving aid may be 5%, 10%, whatever. Once you are receiving any aid, then 3 applies. 1 applies, 1 is wholly out of state funds.
So, meaning thereby, if you have a madrasa or a gurukul, for both, I am saying, without receiving any aid, you impart religious education, not religious instruction, no difficulty. But the moment you start accepting something from the government, constitution steps in, and whether...
This will be important. Just read 3 once again.
Yes, Madam. No person attending any educational institution recognized by the state.
So, 1 requirement is recognized by the state. Number 2 is...
Or receiving aid out of the state fund.
Now, here, the words are not used wholly funded by the state.
Correct, Madam. Yes.
Any aid received by the state.
Not wholly.
If not wholly. So, if we read it as an exception to 1, then it may be permissible even for wholly funded state institutions to impart religious education.
Not wholly.
You're not accepting that position. Your position is if it's wholly funded by the state, then number 1 apply, clause 1 will apply. Be careful what you're saying, it may have repercussions.
Actually, clause 1 imposes an absolute bar. Right?
Correct.
That if you are funded wholly out of state funds, you cannot have a religious instruction at all. That's clause 1. Clause 2 lifts the bar, which is evident from the use of the words nothing in clause 1.
One, it's an exception to one.
It's an exception to 1. Now, what 3 does is 3 imposes a requirement when you are receiving any aid, or of course recognition. You're not in the recognition aspect right now. So 3 is conditioned if you are receiving any aid, even if you are receiving 5% aid or 1% aid from the state, 3 applies. And what does 3 say? 3 says is that you can have religious instruction, but you can't make it compulsory, unless in the case of a minor, the parents or the guardian consent. Therefore, 3 in that sense, 1 applies only where you are wholly funded by the state. Even if you are not wholly funded by the state, you cannot compulsorily have religious instruction, which therefore means that if you are not funded by the state, you can make religious instruction compulsory. There's no difficulty. If you are funded by the state, whether wholly or in part, at the least, if you are funded in part, you are receiving any aid, because it says receiving aid. If you are receiving aid, you cannot have compulsory religious instruction. That's the purport of.
That's the middle of the way. Then if somebody wants,
but if you are wholly funded by the state, you cannot have any religious instruction at all.
Even with consent. Even with consent.
Even with consent.
Is that the stand?
Even if you are not receiving,
Pardon?
but if you are a recognized institution,
and
you cannot come.
And recognized. So if it's either way. If you are recognized but you are not receiving aid from the state, you cannot have compulsory religious instruction.
No, but therefore, if we accept your position, if it's a non-minority institution, can they impart religious education?
So, yes, subject to 28(3).
But then 28(3) as per the stand taken by you will only apply to non-fully funded institutions.
So a non-minority institution which does not receive any aid, you can have compulsory religious instruction.
Yes, no, like you.
But even if you're a non-minority institution and you're receiving any aid from the state, you can't have compulsory religious instruction.
Correct. And
So
therefore,
28 applies. 28 is agnostic to whether you belong to the minority or otherwise.
Correct.
28 applies
No,
across.
that's not PMFI also recognized.
As Brother Suryakanth says, 28 draws no distinction between whether you are a minority or non-minority.
No, that's what I say. 28 is agnostic provision. Whether you are minority or non-minority. It is
Also because 28 occurs in a subtitle or subpart
Exactly,
called
Manoj.
right to freedom of religion.
Yes,
that
Manoj.
applies to everybody.
29 and 30 only talks of minority.
Cultural and educational rights.
Yes.